everybody, and welcome back to another week of Life Books. If you haven't been with us, this is our third week in a series, kind of a mini series, where I've been sharing some of the books of the Bible that have been deep and meaningful in my life. And my hope is that they've been really deep and meaningful in your life as well. So far, we've gone through the book of Amos and the book of Hebrews, so one from the New Testament and one from the Old Testament. Swap those around. But this week we're doing something a little bit different because there are this group of books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, called the Gospels in the New Testament. They kick off the New Testament. And I was thinking, maybe it'd be great to go through one of those Gospels with you tonight. But then I started to think, there's one book that's kind of really closely associated with the Gospels. It's actually considered like a second half to one of the Gospels. And I thought that we could go through that tonight. Now, have you guessed which book I'm talking about? Let me give you a second hint before we continue on. This book of the Bible was written by one of the people that wrote one of the Gospels, and it's basically the second half, and it's about the birth of the church. Now, if you haven't guessed already, we're talking about the book of Acts, and it was written by Luke, who wrote, you guessed it, the book of Luke, one of the Gospels. And it's this amazing continuation on from the book of Luke, where we see the life of Jesus and his interactions with the disciples, and then him leaving, departing his disciples in the book of Acts, but then the birth of the church happening. And it is an incredible moment, and it's really, really good. So I wanted to talk about that tonight. So again, in a nutshell, what we're seeing is the birth of the church. But Jesus, in chapter 1, when he is departing his disciples, promises them the gift of the Holy Spirit. Now, we read a lot about the Holy Spirit in Acts chapter 2 when the Holy Spirit does come, but we then see something incredible happen. We see the birth of the church that would now we see everywhere, right? The big C church, not just a church building, but the body of people who are made up of Christ followers being created again in Acts chapter 2. So in Acts chapter 1, right at the beginning of the passage, you hear Jesus say this: "Do not leave Jerusalem until the Father sends you the gift he promised, as I told you before. John baptized with water, but in just a few days you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit." Now, Jesus is leaving this kind of ominous message, and his disciples don't know what he's talking about. But then in Acts chapter 2, we see this amazing thing happen. It says this: "On the day of Pentecost, all the believers were meeting together in one place. Suddenly there was a loud sound from heaven, like a roaring of a mighty windstorm, and it filled the house where they were sitting." God's promised gift, the Holy Spirit, was finally there, and all of a sudden, the birth of the church comes out of this moment. The believers that were there together in that place, in that room on the day of Pentecost, all of a sudden starts to spread and spread and spread, and all of a sudden we see the global church begin. And what's cool about the book of Acts is that we see the church as God intended. Right? We see the birth of something special because of the power of the Holy Spirit. But then we know throughout history that the church kind of makes some weird moves, right? There are some kind of weird things that happen in church history, and all of a sudden we're led to what the church is today, and we know it's flawed. It's made up of people, which means that there are some challenges in church. But back at the beginning of what the church was created to be, it's not that it was without tension, because it was still made up of humans, but there was something so special about what was happening in the beginning of the book of Acts and what we see throughout the book of Acts. Now, there are all sorts of these other kind of subplots happening. There's different stories of different people, and they're all really interesting, and they all, again, contribute to what we see as the early church. So I'd encourage you to read it if you haven't already. One story that's particularly interesting is the story of Saul, a guy who would become Paul, and his kind of conversion. He completely does a 180 in his life and eventually goes on to write most of the letters that we read in the New Testament. And so if you haven't read that story, man, it is incredible. And it's really important, I think, to understand where the people who wrote the Bible actually came from. Remember, what we're reading about in the book of Acts are first-hand accounts, right? It doesn't always work like that. There are some stories in the Old Testament that we're reading about that are told throughout the generations, and so they're not actually first-hand accounts, whereas the book of Acts is a first-hand account from Luke and the disciples that he put around him. And so with a story like Paul, we see his origin story from a first-hand point of view from Luke. Now, one of the big reasons that the book of Acts is so important to me is because of what it represents in terms of the church. I've devoted my life to serving the church, and I love it. I love to be able to see what Christ was doing in that group of believers right at the beginning, and trying to figure out like how I can continue to invest myself back in more to what God's trying to do today. So that's a very quick overview of what the book of Acts is about. Again, there's all sorts of these subplots, different things happening. I'd encourage you to read it. But tonight in your small groups, I actually want you to talk a little bit about that. What do you know about the book of Acts? Have you read it before? Are there any of these stories of people like Paul that you've read and you're like, man, that's a really inspiring story? Maybe you need to open it up and take a look at the book of Acts and reacquaint yourself with what's happening. Now, I'll give you one little teaser for your small group. There's a story about teleportation in the book of Acts, and it has always fascinated me. It's always been one of the like kind of quirkiest things that you can read in the Bible. So try and find that and explain it a little bit. If you need more help on that, maybe Google it, or you can message me. Have your leader message me and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. It is fascinating and amazing, and I'm going to leave it there for tonight. So enjoy your small groups. I hope that you can talk and have a really great discussion about the book of Acts. It's an amazing book. It's chock full of amazing things that are happening and seeing God at work. And so I hope that you are inspired by that. So have a great evening, and we'll talk to you again soon.